Hello and welcome to today's in-depth and step-by-step Lightroom tutorial where I want to show you all of the possibilities that you have within Lightroom and also how you can use all of the sliders, adjustments and techniques and filters to get the most out of your picture. And I'm actually going to take you along with the whole process by taking this raw file right here and turning it into a photo like this at the end, and to really make the colors pop, create differentiation in the lighting. And I really want to show you beneficial information whether you're a complete beginner with Lightroom or you're a more advanced user. Oh, and because this video is going to be very long, you can actually download the raw file if you want and just edit along with me. So if you want to do that, then just pause the video and check the link in the video description. Alright, so the first thing that I like to do is bring down the highlight slider in the basics adjustments, and this will retrieve a lot of the highlight detail in the sky. So you can do that maybe by 50, maybe by 70, but I actually like to go all the way down to -100. And the reason for that is so I can bring up the whites much more than I could otherwise do, and by bringing up the whites, it really creates a lot of dynamic and interest to the picture. So here, from the difference from 0 to quite a lot, it's really huge. And here you just want to make sure that you hold down the Alt or CMD key on a Mac and just make sure that you don't have too much clipped. Any other color than black means that this area is clipped. So if it's just the sun, you know, a relatively small area, or maybe a lamp or something like that, it doesn't really matter too much. You're better off just looking at the rest of your picture and go for whatever looks best. But if it, you know, looks something like this and it's really a huge area that's clipped, you want to make sure that you don't go quite as far because, I mean, as you can see it without the filter as well, it's just completely white. But I think I'm gonna go for maybe something like this here. Always want to check with the actual clipped warning along with the real look. So I think this actually works quite well. Then the next very crucial thing, and this is something that you don't necessarily have to do, but for my personal editing workflow I like to do it, is just bring up the shadows by 100. And this will of course bring up the shadows, but it makes your whole picture a lot brighter. As you can see from before to after, I really love that look, and it's something that you at least want to consider. But the negative effect of bringing up the shadows is that it washes out your picture a little bit and definitely gets rid of a lot of the contrast, but you can very easily fix that by bringing the contrast slider to the right. And here I wouldn't go too far because it's very easy to make your picture look unnatural. So just go by eye and go for something maybe around 30 to 40, so it really looks natural at the end. And you can actually combine that with the black slider, and I usually like to bring that down a little bit. You can also hold down the Alt key here and just make sure that there actually is a little bit of black clipped, because it can really work for some areas in the picture to be completely black, and that way you will of course get a lot more contrast, but also some differentiation from the darks to the bright parts of your picture. So from just these 5 sliders already, we have quite a huge difference of the picture, and this is really just a start. So then let's go into the clarity, and here it's very important that you don't just go into the plus clarity. You can of course check and see how it looks, but in quite a lot of the cases, especially in sunset pictures, just as this one right here, actually going a little bit into the minus clarity can really help your picture and overall mood much more. And clarity is especially something that most people don't even, you know, kind of forget that there's actually an option to go into the minus. And this is a thing to be constantly aware of with any slider in Lightroom. The beautiful thing about Lightroom is that you can pretty much bring any slider either towards the left or the right. You really don't have to just increase something, you can also decrease it. So in short, just try out both minus and plus and go for whatever looks best, but by bringing up the clarity you will just increase the very harsh textures that you have. For example here you can really well see it on the trees. By going into the extremes, it really separates these trees, whereas going into the extreme minus, they kind of go together and the whole very fine structure and the very fine contrast isn't as much defined. So this can really work in your favor, and once again, in a sunset picture that is already quite soft, it can really work to go a little bit into the minus. Just be sure to not completely wash out your picture. Vibrance and saturation is actually something that you might be better off by leaving out. Now, of course, if you have a very washed out picture, then you can definitely add either vibrance or saturation, or maybe even both, because vibrance will just kind of add color in a more overall way, and especially kind of choose more of the cooler tones, whereas the saturation chooses a lot more of the warmer tones. So it might be just a good idea to play around with it yourself and go a little bit into the saturation, a little bit into the vibrance and so on. But as I was saying at the start, I would actually leave them out for now because you're still gonna have a lot of other color adjustments. So it's gonna be very difficult to choose the right amount of saturation and vibrance just now. And then color temperature is actually something that is very important because of course it decides how cool or how warm your picture is. But there isn't really a way that I can tell you what to do here because every single picture is different and at the end you really have to decide for yourself. But there is a little trick that I can give you, and actually two, and the first thing is already choose your color temperature in camera to something that is relatively close to what you see with your eye. And even though you won't lose any detail by adjusting the slider in post if you shot a RAW file, you will still have a nice reference to start off with, and then you can always adjust that later on. Then the next thing is actually, especially here in sunset pictures, it might be very tempting to go into the warm tones like crazy, and this is something that I see all the time, and frankly I've done it in the past a lot as well, but as I started to edit more and more pictures, I actually found a better way to go about it, especially in sunset pictures, but also generally speaking with pretty much all pictures. And that is just to keep it in between something where you still have warm tones, but you also still have blue tones. And that way you will just get a lot more differentiation from the warm tones to the blue tones, and you get much more colors, and it's just much more interesting if you ask me. Now, of course, you can bring it a little bit more towards one side that you want. For example, here, I do think I'm gonna make it a little bit warmer since it is a sunset, but I still want some of these blues and some of these cooler tones to be there and not just blow everything by going into the complete warm tone craziness right here. So this is just kind of my two techniques: already choose your color temperature in camera and then go for something that is kind of between the warm and the cool levels. And honestly, especially between the warm and cool levels, this is something that has hugely dramatically increased the quality of my pictures. It really makes it look so much more interesting. I just can't stress it enough how important that is. Then tint is something, of course, if you have a tint in your picture, then you can equivalate that out by going into either side. But for sunset pictures, it can make sense to go a little bit into the magenta tint, but definitely don't go too far, otherwise you will get kind of a non-natural cast. So I think that's pretty much all of the basics adjustments. Let's just quickly see again from the RAW file to after. It's already a huge difference, but we're nowhere near done yet. So let's go into the total curve and maybe even speed up the whole pace a little bit. But I just wanted to go over the basics adjustments very in depth because these sliders are definitely one of the most important that you have in all of Lightroom. They will just kind of set your overall look already, and then with everything else you will just kind of enhance that look. Anyways, let's go into the total curve, and the first thing you might notice is that you have the highlight sliders as well as the shadow sliders. And this is something very confusing because unlike the highlight and shadow sliders up in the basics adjustments, they do a very different thing. For example, if I move around the basics adjustments highlight slider, especially if you look at the sky, you can see it really adjusts the whole brightness very overall in a very broad way. Whereas I move around the highlight slider in the total curve, it will just adjust the very bright part of your picture. And the same thing with the shadows here in the basic adjustments. It's a very broad adjustment, whereas the shadows in the tonal curve will just kind of affect the very dark shadows. So here you can really see the difference as I move these two around. So very confusing, but I hope you understand the difference. And the first thing that I would actually suggest you to do is bring up the highlights in the tonal curve a little bit. Because this increases just the very bright parts, it also makes your whole dynamic and whole differentiation from dark to bright even more severe. And you of course want to make sure that you don't go too far with it. You don't want to make your sky look something like this. but just a little bit can definitely help in quite a lot of the cases. Then the shadows here, also you can maybe bring them down to even get more distinct blacks and get a little bit more contrast, but you can also bring them up. It really decides, or it really depends on your picture and your decision. It's very, very different from picture to picture, and the most important thing is just to understand the difference from the tonal curve adjustments to the basic adjustments, and then just try out the different looks and the different positions for yourself. And then you also have the lights and darks. They are kind of the medium lights and darks adjustments respectively. But the best thing here is once again just to play around with them. I don't really have a set tactic for them, so just go with whatever you like best and just play around. And generally speaking, with these tonal curve adjustments, you don't want to go too far in either direction, but just play around with it a little bit and go with whatever looks best. And lastly, you also have the point curve. Here you can choose between linear, medium and strong contrast. This is a very fine contrast that you can try out, but honestly in most landscape pictures it doesn't really work for me. And maybe in kind of black and white dramatic pictures it might work, but for most landscape pictures I just leave it at linear, but feel free to play around with it. And as you can see, the difference from before to after is nowhere near as strong as we had in the basics adjustments with all of these sliders. But it's not meant to be. It's really all about refining everything that you have rather than just shaping the look of your initial picture completely. And if there's something that is maybe a little bit too much, you can of course just go back to it and move the slider. That's really one of the beautiful things about Lightroom. Then let's go into the HSL tool, and the thing that I want to mention is that you don't necessarily have to go from the first into the second adjustment to the third adjustment at all. You can skip adjustments, you can go from the first to the last and into the middle, whatever you like best, but just for the sake of the video, I think it makes more sense to keep it structured as Lightroom has it laid out. So I'm just gonna go from first to last step by step. So HSL tool is actually something that doesn't have a huge adjustment. It's really mostly about fine-tuning the color hues and tonalities. So in quite a lot of the tutorials and even in my personal edits, I just skip this tool entirely because it doesn't have a huge impact. But that being said, because this is really a hugely in-depth, very step-by-step tutorial, I of course also want to cover the HSL tool. So pretty much what you have here is hue, saturation and luminance, and here you can adjust the respective hues, saturations or luminance of course of the respective colors. And you can do that by moving around the sliders, but what I actually like to do much more, that I think makes more sense, is just to grab this little pinpointer and go over a color in your picture and just move down or up the mouse. Now a thing to note here is that you cannot really change the different tones of the respective colors. So pretty much what that means, green is green, blue is blue, orange is orange. You can't really change the light hue of the greens and then go on to the medium hue of the greens and then kind of the dark hue of the greens. It's really just green is green, blue is blue, and so on. So just go over any major color that you have in your picture. For example, here is definitely green is one of them. And just bring down and up the mouse and just choose for yourself what looks best. As you can see, not a huge difference, but I think I'm gonna make this a little bit more, well actually a little bit warmer. That definitely works. And then do the exact same thing with the blues, also go into the minus and the plus. And once again, just make sure that it still looks natural and that you don't go too far with any of these adjustments. Then lastly, I think just go with the orange tones, and you know, even though there are some other very faint colors, for example red right here, it's really all about the major colors that you have in your picture, because if you try to go into the reds here, it will also change the oranges a little bit. So once again, as I said at the start, doesn't have a huge impact, isn't really super important, but it is something that you can at least change the overall perception of the very basic colors. And then just go to saturation, do the exact same thing, grab this little pinpointer, go over your major colors in your picture and maybe bring up the greens a little bit, then go into the blues and just increase the blues also a little bit. And do the exact same thing with the oranges and just check what I want to do here. And then lastly, you can go into the luminance and once again do the exact same thing over again. And this is relatively boring, relatively easy explained, but I think it is still worth to at least quickly mention for the sake of this video. So lastly, with the orange tones, don't really gonna change too much here. And I'm actually done with the HSL tool. Luckily it didn't take too much time, but here's before, here's after. As in all pictures, of course, sometimes it will have a lesser, sometimes a bigger impact, but overall it's very, very low and not very important at all. But, you know, if you would really want to look closely, then you can see a little bit of a difference. So let's go on to the split toning, which is a tool that I absolutely love and that has a much bigger effect than the HSL tool. And here, first of all, what I would suggest you to do is go into the highlights, click on this little box, and you will get this color palette. And here, just go through all of the colors that you have and see what they do to your picture. Now, even though usually I like to add warm tones, in this kind of photo, I'm actually not sure what I want to go for. So once again, just choose all of the colors, go for a relatively high saturation at first, you actually see the color and not just have a very faint idea of it. And here, let's actually try a little bit of a bluish color. I'm not sure if that works. Yeah, I actually think it's quite difficult. Let's see what the warm tones do. Yeah, you know what? If I go into the warm tones here, it makes the picture a little bit too boring. But if I go here into the blue, kind of purplish tones, and just adjust the saturation to something that actually looks natural, I really think we can actually get some differentiation and some true interest into this picture, additionally to what we had before. So pretty much in short, highlights is just, it adds colors to the highlights of your picture. And of course, since highlights is where your color is naturally coming from, it really makes sense to go for a color that also looks natural. So for example, green might not work as well, but maybe like warm tones especially. I use warm tones in quite a lot of my pictures, but you can also go with kind of a reddish, purplish, bluish tone and get the look that you want that way. So I'm just gonna go here into this hue right there. I think that works pretty well, and then go down into the saturation to something that doesn't look too overdone. So then you have the exact same thing with the shadows, and once again, since naturally the colors are coming from the highlights, whether that be a sun or a lamp or whatever, it doesn't really give you so much opportunity to adjust the shadows, because here it's much easier to make it look completely terrible. But that being said, just moving it around a little bit and still seeing the different color possibilities can still make sense. For example, here, I actually think I'm gonna make the dark parts a little bit more warm, and in terms of the saturation, you know, really just a hint, nothing crazy. Maybe around 5 or 7% or something like that. And I might even go back to the highlights real quick and fine adjust the actual hue. So from before to after, you might not think that this is a huge difference, and certainly it isn't as much as it could be in some other pictures, but what it's mainly about is not really to add too much color, especially here. It's more about really choosing your hue for the highlights and the shadows that you really want. So from before, where it kind of looked a little bit greenish in the lake and in the bluish parts, and it was a little bit too cool in the foreground, we now really have a refined, more colorful and more pleasing overall look. Then detail tool is something that is fairly important for an overall picture. Definitely doesn't matter in terms of your overall colors or look, but what I would suggest you to do here is actually zoom in 1:1. And this picture was shot at ISO 100, but we've raised the shadows by 100. So you will get a little bit of noise, actually quite a lot in this case, but most of it is actually color noise, so it's very, very easily fixable. And by the way, this was shot with a Canon 18-55 kit lens on a Canon 600D, which is I think a 4 or 5 year old beginner entry-level camera with a kit lens, so you really don't have to have expensive gear to do this kind of editing on any picture. But anyways, let's zoom back in 1:1 here. And before I do anything else, I'm just gonna move the color slider to the right. And here I would really wish that Lightroom would call it color noise reduction or something like that, because what it does is truly get rid of all of the purple and green sensor noise in your picture. And if I show you the difference, you might not be able to see this if you watch this in 360p, but if you watch this in Full HD on a big monitor, you will absolutely see the difference, especially in the dark parts of these trees. As I bring the color slider to the right, it looks so much cleaner, and it's really a huge thing. It doesn't have any bad impact. As you can see here, if I zoom out and I change around the slider, it doesn't have any bad impact. It just makes your picture so much cleaner. And honestly, this is one of the best sliders, one of the easiest sliders in all of Lightroom. Absolutely be sure to take advantage of it. And by the way, if that's still not enough, then you could go into the smoothness and even go further with the actual effect. And I think that really does a huge difference. So from before all of that to after, it's already really a huge difference. Believe me, if you see this in person, it's completely different. Alright, so after praising the color noise reduction tool for 5 minutes, let's go into the actual noise reduction itself. And of course, if you raise the shadows, you will still have some noise, because not everything is color noise. But the thing here is, I really don't like the tool too much, because it really decreases the overall clarity, crispness and sharpness of the picture a lot. And it's even noticeable if you're zoomed out. It makes it really look much more plasticky and just less detailed, which is something that I absolutely don't like at all. But that being said, if you really have a ton of noise, and once again, we've brought up the shadows by 100 here, it was shot kind of in the later time of the day. And of course there are a lot of quite dark shadows from the trees and so on. You do have a little bit more noise than you usually would have. So what I would suggest you to do here is really just go as far as you really need it to be. And honestly, this picture, once again, I brought up the shadows by 100. I shot this at ISO 100. Which is not as low as some newer cameras will go, with a 5-year-old Canon camera which has very poor dynamic range, not a great ISO performance, even at ISO 100. So point being, if you would have a newer, even entry-level camera, and certainly something more expensive as a D810 or something like that, you will have a much better noise initially, and you won't have that much grain as I have here. But anyways, just move the noise reduction slider just as much as you really need it to be, and I'd rather have a little bit of noise than really a hugely plastically image. So then let's go into the sharpness, and this is actually a slider that I really like, because here you can have a huge difference in terms of the overall crispness and sharpness, especially if you print your picture, but even if you are zoomed out. And if I show you the extreme example here, I mean, I'm not sure how well this is gonna show up on video after the compression, but in person, even zoomed out fully, it looks so much crisper and so much sharper if I bring that all the way to the right. The amount of sharpness you want to use really depends on the export size. So for example, if I would export this for 500px or Facebook or my website, then I would want to make sure that there's really a lot of sharpness, because it looks the crispest that way. But at the same time, if you want to print your picture with sharpness to 150, you can see we get all of this texture, and that's really not something that you want. So that's only something that you can do as long as you're not going to be able to zoom in to see that texture. So what I would suggest you to do at the start is just go maybe around 50 to 70 sharpness, really depending on the conditions you took the picture, and of course the lens itself. But I think it's a really nice compromise to just add a little bit of sharpness and then zoom out and bring the masking slider to the right while holding down the Alt or CMD key on a Mac. And here you just want to make sure that you don't have too many of the non-textured surfaces sharpened. So everything that is white is sharpened, everything that is black is not sharpened. And you don't have to get it perfect, you just want to make sure that it doesn't look something like this, where pretty much all of the sky and water is sharpened. Something like that is already good enough. So sharpening is really a science for itself, and I honestly bring every picture into Photoshop and sharpen there with layers and, selective masking and so on before I finally export the picture. But just as a general idea, And as a general starting point that you can do, just adding a little bit of sharpness and masking is a really good idea. So from before any detail tool adjustments to after, I should probably zoom in here, but if I show you the difference, now this is gonna show before any of the default color noise reduction, but you can see it looks a lot crisper, a lot sharper, and especially the color noise reduction slider itself is really huge. It has a huge difference, and I would absolutely at least take advantage of that slider right here. Alright, so let's finally move on to the lens corrections and move closer to the end of the global adjustments at least. I know this is a very long video, but the thing that you want to do here is just to click on remove chromatic aberration, and what this will do is get rid of the purple and green fringing on the high contrast edges. So for example, without, you can see especially well here in the trees, and afterwards it just gets rid of the purple and green fringing. And if that's still not enough, then you could go into the manual here and go even further into the amount, but I would just leave that alone unless you absolutely have to do it and you still have a ton of fringing left. And also just click on enable profile corrections. That will get rid of the distortion as well as the vignetting of your lens, more on that later, but it's definitely a nice thing to just have. So then transform tool. Honestly, this is a thing that I don't really use most of the times, because especially in landscape pictures, as I go through the different automatic tools right here, it probably doesn't even do anything. But if you would have an architecture picture or something like that, then it might be, or something else that is really important where you want to have very straight lines, then it might be worth to go into these automatic and just try out what looks best. And if that's still not enough, then you can also go into the transform and manually adjust that even more, or go into the guided and give you guidelines of the straight lines. But once again, for landscapes or most pictures in fact, it's really not important and I just leave it out. It's really mainly for architecture, and even then it's completely optional. But anyways, let's go on into the effects, and effects is actually something that I really love. And the thing that I actually like to add is vignetting. And why just add vignetting down here if I previously removed the vignetting in the lens corrections? So the thing is, every lens will have darker corners, and this in the lens correction will just fix that. It will get rid of the dark corners and it will just give you an overall very even exposure. But what the vignetting down here will do is, I mean, it's pretty much the same idea, but you have much more control over it. So for example, I could add vignetting and at the same time bring the midpoint more towards the center. I'm just going to show you the extreme example so you actually see the difference. And I can actually choose how much of the dark corners I want in the picture. And I can also bring the feather to the right, so all of the transition really becomes much smoother. There are some other adjustments as well, but these are really the most important ones. And why would you even want to add vignetting? Why make corners darker? So the reason for it is so it gives you more attention on the center, but it also sets the mood and kind of makes it more dark. It's just something that you want to try out, because in some pictures it might not work, but in a lot of pictures it does work. So just play around with it and see for yourself if you like the look better with some vignetting. And of course you don't want to make it look something like that, because that's completely terrible. You'd really just want to add a little bit so you don't even really notice that there was any vignetting added. And from before any vignetting to after, it really helps to give at the same time more attention on the center, but also less attention on the actual edges. So then grain is another thing that you have in the effects tool, but here, you know, unless you want to go for a vintage film look or something like that, just leave that at 0. And down here with the haze, this is something that many people are excited about. Honestly, I barely ever use it, and I don't really think it makes so much sense to use it, because what it's meant for is to decrease the haze and mist and get more detail in it and kind of cut through the haze. And while I see it useful in some pictures, if you already have haze, then I think it makes much more sense to use that as an advantage and as an interest point of your picture, rather than to get rid of it. But, you know, if you, for example, have an airplane, you want to photograph an airplane and you have a little bit of haze, but not so much that it adds to the mood, then it might be a good idea to add a little bit here. Also, you can go into the minus as with pretty much all of the sliders and also kind of create a more hazy look, but it doesn't really work that well, and you know, honestly, I'd just leave it at 0 unless you want to do something with it, but in itself, it's not that important of a tool. So then camera calibration, this is finally the last global adjustment. Afterwards we're still going to go into the local adjustments, of course. But what you have here, first of all, is profile. And you will only be able to change a profile if you're working with a RAW file. So other than that, it really makes sense to shoot RAW. It gives you a lot more information, a lot more detail, better quality at the end. Definitely shoot RAW, and this is just one more advantage of it. But basically what you can do here is change your overall profile look. So this will just kind of change your overall color, your hue, and really change the overall appearance of your picture. Now this is something that might not work in every single case. For example, here I haven't really found anything that I like better than the Adobe standard, so I'm actually just gonna leave it at Adobe standard. But if there is something that you like better, then it can really have a huge difference, so I think it's definitely worth to play around with, and you know, if there's nothing, then just stick with Adobe standard. And then finally, the primary color sliders. What they will do is change the primary color, who would have guessed? But what this pretty much means is just that if I, for example, would change the blue slider here, it will also adjust the reds and the greens and so on, because every color is mixed out of a certain amount of the other color. So maybe it makes not so much sense, but pretty much just play around with these sliders, see what you like best. And once again, there's really nothing I can tell you, because this is very, very different from picture to picture. But generally speaking, it doesn't work to go too far in either way here. And I hope this isn't lagging too much, because this is very hardware intensive. And of course, additionally to just adjusting these sliders, I'm also recording. But this shouldn't take too long, and you know, maybe just change a little bit here. And the reds didn't really work, by the way. So let's just bring them down a bit more. And then go into the blues, see what they do. And yeah, maybe a little bit more into the light blues, just something like that, and might as well add a bit of saturation. And from before to after, I actually don't really like what I've done with the reds right here, so I'm just gonna reset the reds actually. But I do like the blue tones a little bit better, you know, it's really almost no difference, but I mean, since you're already here, you can at least try it out if you haven't done it already, but then you might also just skip it, it doesn't really matter too much. So we're finally done with the global adjustments, and I know this is a very long video, but as a very last thing, actually, this is a nice point to do it, is just go into the vibrance and saturation. Remember how I said we're gonna go back to it afterwards, after we have a better understanding of the color. So this is a good time to do it now, and I think I'm just gonna increase the vibrance a little bit, and maybe also bring up the saturation just a hint, although not too much. And with that said, we're really finally done with the global adjustments. Here's before any adjustments, here's afterwards, and it's already a huge difference, and we haven't even touched the local adjustments yet. So let's go into the local adjustments, and let's actually just cover everything right here real quick. So first thing you have is the crop overlay. This isn't really a local adjustment. Here you can just change your angle and your crop and whatever. So it is great to do that to make sure that your horizon is straight, but here I don't really think there's too much to be changed. Then the next thing you have is the spot removal tool. This is a very important thing, and I would absolutely suggest you to go over your sky and just make sure, you know, if you have a sensor or dirt or dust spot or something like that, then you can very easily grab this little spot removal tool. Always want to make sure that it's on heal, and feather and opacity, you know, just want to make sure that your opacity is by 100, feather somewhere in the middle, and of course size just as big as you really need it. And then just go over an object that you want to remove. This is mostly good with very simple objects, once again as with dust or dirt spots. And as you can see, it did a pretty good job. If it didn't, then you can right click and select new source, but here I don't really see any dust or dirt spots. Then the next thing is red eye correction, that is just for portraits. So let's go on to the graduated filters, and finally something that we're gonna use in this picture, because the graduated filter can have a huge difference to your photo. This is a tool that you want to use for large adjustments to your photo. So the first thing I'm actually going to do here is drag one over the sky, and you always want to make sure that you have a decently soft edge. So if I just show you an adjustment, just for the sake of showing the edge, if I have a very soft edge here, just the adjustment spreads very evenly and organically into the rest of the picture, whereas if you would have it like that, it would just be very harsh. But of course I don't want to go in that far into the minus exposure. Anyways, let's fix that filter right here, and then for the sky there's actually a lot of things that you can do. You could, for example, increase the contrast and maybe even go into the minus exposure, and this is really something that is very dependent on your picture. I think I'm actually going to go a little bit into the minus exposure just for the sky here, reset the contrast for now, and in exchange go into the plus whites. I really like that look, and maybe even go into the plus shadows. So because this is a very soft and sunset picture, I don't really think it works too much if there are some dark shadows in the clouds. And in terms of contrast, now if you have very stormy clouds, then going into the plus contrast might actually work, but if you have a very soft sky like here, then you might even want to consider going a little bit into the minus contrast. And this is before, this is after. I think it works a little bit, makes it a bit more interesting, but here is also, this is the way you would want to fix the exposure in the sky if it was way too bright. Then I'm gonna grab a new one, and this time just drag it over the very top of the picture, and with an even softer edge this time, and go a little bit into the minus exposure. And the reason I want to do that is so I have a difference from the very top of the sky to the middle of the sky to where the sun is coming from. And this can really help to contain your viewer's attention within the picture, but at the same time also create differentiation and interest with exposure. And here's already before any graduated filters, here's after. It definitely already had a little bit of a difference. Then I'm also gonna add another minus exposure filter over the very bottom, once again just to close out the picture and get kind of less attention towards the bottom, and also create some differentiation in terms of the exposure. Pretty much the exact same thing as I've done with the top filter of the sky. And if you want to do that, then just be sure not to go too far, because it's very easy to make it look unnatural. Another option that you have with the graduated filters is to make the dark side a little bit darker and the bright side more bright, and that increases the dynamic and differentiation even more. However, there's already a lot of differentiation from the dark trees to the bright highlights in the sky, so I don't really think it's needed in this particular photo. Then another thing that is actually very important is to create differentiation in terms of the colors. So for example here, we have, just look at the sky for a second. So we have the sun, which is quite yellowish, orangey, going into the red tones, going into the purple tones, going into the blue tones. But there is still a little bit more that you can do. So what I'm gonna do is just drag another graduated filter over the sky, just kind of angle it, and once again, very, very soft edge. This is very important here. And then you can go either into the color temperature or go into the color right here, and this will also give you a color palette that we've seen before in the split toning, and you can change your actual hue here. For example, I want to go or have it go a little bit more into the blue tones. So I'm actually going to choose quite light blue here, and of course adjust the actual saturation to something that looks more feasible, and maybe even fine adjust that with a little bit with the tint. And there's really much that you can do here. You can spend a ton of time, but pretty much the most important thing here, or with this particular technique, is to create differentiation in terms of the color in a natural way. Then let's grab another one, and this time kind of a smaller one, also with a very soft edge, and drag one over the bottom left here, and also make this a little bit more bluish, and that is just so we have the bottom left more cold and bluish compared to the kind of warmer schemes or warmer colors from where the sun is coming from. This can also definitely work. And you know, in some pictures you will have a bigger impact or more possibilities for it than in others, but here it already has had a little bit of a difference. I'm definitely going to go further with the colors, with the rail filters and adjustment brushes, but in terms of the graduated filters, I think that's pretty much all I'm going to do to this photo. So here's from before any graduated filters, here's after. It definitely helps to refine everything a little bit more, and you know, it's not a huge difference, but especially if you look at the color, for example, now we have it really going into the blue tones, whereas before in the sky it was maybe a little bit too dull and a little bit too even, so that's definitely working quite well. So then, before I actually go into the rail filters, which is for the dodge and burning, let's go into the adjustment brush, and I would suggest you to use the adjustment brush for everything which needs kind of a large adjustment. So for example, if you would want to add more vignetting over just some areas, you could do that way. Or also maybe if you were going to have an adjustment brush with just certain colors, you could also do it that way. And that is exactly what I'm going to use it for here, because previously with the graduated filters, I've already adjusted the colors and the differentiation, but sometimes there's just some stuff that you can't do with the graduated filters because its effect is too big. So then grabbing an adjustment brush for that is a good idea. And here, I think I'm just going to go over this area right here. If I show you the O key or press down the O key, you can see the mask. And then just adjust the colors here. For example, I'm actually not even sure what I want to go to here. Maybe also kind of, you know what, even more of a reddish tone perhaps. And really just add a little bit, you know, this doesn't need much. And then go grab another one and perhaps go a little bit more here and also change up the color a bit more. And you know, this is very much up to you how far you want to go, how much you want to add in terms of the color and the filters, but it is definitely an option that you have and it can work quite a lot of the times. And I think I'm actually going to add another adjustment brush just over this part right here, and actually this time just increase the color temperature. And I think, you know, not as much. Also press down the O key here. And by the way, you can just hold down the Alt or ZMD key and you will get a minus adjustment brush where you can remove previously adjusted areas. So that's also a nice thing if you want to kind of, you know, select something very carefully and make sure it doesn't spill over any side. So once again, press down the O key, and I just want to make this a little bit warmer here. Nothing crazy though, so that should work quite well. And I think this is really all I'm going to do in terms of the adjustment brushes. Here's from before and here's after. Really just some small differences, but it definitely, you know, it depends on picture to picture once again how big of a difference it can actually have. So then let's go into the final and last adjustment, which is the rail filters. And rail filters are actually huge. This is nothing like the adjustment brush I showed you before, because with the rail filters you can add dodge and burning, and dodge and burning is making individual parts of your picture either darker or brighter. And even though you can do that with the adjustment brush as well, I think going with the rail filter just gives you much more opportunity. So I'm just gonna drag one rail filter, a pretty big one right here, and actually go crazily into the plus exposure just to show you the importance of bringing the feather to 100. As you can see here, the feather is currently at 100, and as I would bring that down, it would just make the whole edge much harsher. So you really want to make sure that you bring that all the way to the right and you have a very, very soft edge. As you can see, even with this really crazily overdone adjustment, the main exposure is definitely here towards the center, and everything around it is really just a clearance area where the effect blends in into the rest of the picture. So anyways, that's very important. Also, of course, you want to make sure that you invert the mask, because if you don't have that selected, then you will adjust everything except for what's in the filter itself. But anyways, I'm gonna start off with plus exposure, and for that, I'm gonna go a little bit into the plus exposure, also go into the plus whites. This is very important to make it look natural, and maybe even a little bit more into the plus exposure. And you can even mix that with contrast and clarity if you really want to, but I think I'm just gonna leave those sliders how they were, because exposure and whites is definitely the most important thing, additionally to those two sliders that are very important. Also going into color and just adding a bit of warmth can really work. And the whole reason why you even want to add dodge and burning, by the way, just look at this area right here, is to add differentiation and complexification in a very small area. So not in terms of the whole picture, which we already have a lot of differentiation from the darks to the bright parts, but also just within a field to maybe make one area a little bit more bright and really have a lot of differentiation that way. And I might even go a little bit further in terms of the color saturation, and since the sun is so close, I can do that without making it look unnatural. And you always want to make sure that you go back and adjust the sliders so you at the end have something that really looks natural, because the whole idea of dodge and burning is just to make everything more interesting. By the way, I'm going to mix a little bit of contrast in here, so make everything more interesting and just more pleasing to look at while still keeping it looking natural. So just right click and duplicate once you have one filter, and you can go to another one and just adjust everything, all of the sliders, all of the adjustments independently from one another. So right here, right click duplicate, and maybe just make these houses a little bit more interesting, and already you can see there's really a huge difference. And this picture has truly huge potential for dodge and burning. So because I don't want to skip anything, I'm just going to give you the whole uncut version of the dodge and burning. If you think it's boring and you already know all about dodge and burning, then you can of course skip ahead. But I think dodge and burning is honestly one of the most important techniques that you can do to your picture. And it will really take a little bit of time until you realize what works, where it works, and also how much works. For example, here I think I'm gonna make a relatively big filter actually, just for the sun itself. And here, I don't want to go too far into the plus exposure, but rather go a little bit into the minus contrast, plus whites, and really make it look as if it would spread the warmth over the entire picture. So this is really something that is great to do. And dodge and burning is a relatively complex thing in itself, because you can mix different filters and you can stack them on top of each other. So if you would like, you can check out the dodge and burning tutorial, where I talk, I think, about 40 minutes really in depth about just dodge and burning and different possibilities and techniques of it. Then you can just check out the link in the description somewhere below. But let's add some other ones. Right click duplicate, and this picture really has huge potential for dodge and burning. And since we're already really long into this video, I want to make sure that I show you everything and don't skip anything, and also not do anything that I wouldn't usually do. So I'm really going to take my time with the dodge and burning here and add as much as I would add if I wouldn't be recording. So right click duplicate, and you can even do that within the water. For example, you can add a pretty big one, and once again just adjust every slider so it really looks appropriate to the actual area, and maybe just here a little bit of plus exposure. And you can even mix that with some other colors. For example, here perhaps go a little bit into the purple and create some differentiation there. The possibilities are really endless. And I'm gonna add another one over here, just to make this part a little bit more interesting. You can really add very big ones, because remember, the actual effect is more towards the center than towards the edges, because the edges are very soft. And right click duplicate, maybe even go over here. You really have to find out for yourself where it works, where it doesn't work. So here a little bit, not quite as much into the whites. And yeah, maybe even bring that down a little bit. Right click duplicate, and you always want to make sure that it looks natural, you don't overdo it. And I might even go over a relatively large area and just add a little bit more warmth here, and also a little bit more whites along with some contrast. And I think in terms of plus exposure dodge and burning, there's not too much to be done anymore, but there's still some minus exposure to be done. But I think in the next few minutes I'm gonna be overall done with the whole dodge and burning. It's really hard to keep talking that long without repeating too much. So especially with dodge and burning, once you get the hang of it, it's actually quite easy. But as you can see, I'm just going on and adding more filters right here. And in terms of the plus exposure, you know, it's always in question how far you want to go. But I think, you know, just another one right here. And perhaps make this area just a little bit more warm, get rid of some of these purple looks, you know, just partially. And once again, this doesn't have to be a complete change of your entire picture. It's all about the subtle differences that really create interest and dynamic. So then another filter right here, just a little bit of warmth, really almost nothing, along with a little bit of plus white. And then let's actually add some more filters, you know, just maybe 1 or 2 more with plus whites, a little bit of plus exposure, and definitely a lot more warm tones, and just go over some areas here as well. And, you know, you could even make very long filters that are maybe not as thick, and make it look as if some, you know, some beam from the sun would have spilled over the entire picture. And once again, there's so much possibility that you have here and so much that you can do, but I think I'm gonna wrap it up very shortly for the plus exposure and just say that I'm done in terms of that after adjusting the saturation here. So here is before any dodge and burning, plus exposure exclusively right now, and here's after. This is a huge difference. It changes your whole picture, and as you can see at the end, it still looks natural. Of course, you don't necessarily have to go quite as far with it, but now what is actually important, because as you can see, even though it looks very interesting and much better than before if you ask me, there are still some areas that are perhaps a little bit too bright. So that is why I want to take some other filters now with minus exposure and with some minus blacks, and I'm even gonna go into the blues a little bit here just to get some differentiation from the warm tones to the blue tones as well. Differentiation is definitely a very big thing in all of editing, and making it look natural while doing all of that is really the most important thing, because just adding different colors is very easy, but doing it in a way where it just adds interest and it doesn't decrease from the quality and naturalness of the picture is really where you have to watch out and really make sure that you do it right. So right click duplicate. I'm just gonna go over some areas that are perhaps a little bit dull or washed out. For example, the dark trees, they are supposed to be dark, so I want to make sure that they remain dark. Then right click duplicate. Same with this spot right here, maybe just a little bit too bright. So right click and duplicate, and you know, in terms of minus exposure, there is usually not as much possibility or as much opportunity as in the plus exposure, but I still think there's some good stuff to be done here. And I think that's pretty much it. You know what, I'm actually gonna grab a relatively big filter here and just go into the blues without any other adjustments, and then just go over this part of the entire side of the mountain or the hill or whatever you want to call it, and just make it a little bit colder, you know, really very narrow, and that will also get you some nice differentiation from the right side, which is kind of more warm. So anyways, I really think I've been repeating myself for 10 minutes now, but it's time to finally say that I'm done, not only with dodge and burning, but with the entire picture. And this is from before any dodge and burning, and this is afterwards. It already changes the picture up quite a bit, and as you can see, even though we do have some nice differentiation from cool to warm, afterwards it's just much more, and it goes without saying that it's completely up to you what you want to do with your picture and how far you want to go with any of these dodge and burning or any other adjustments. I'm just gonna talk a little bit while I refine some small areas. But, you know, I try to show it in a very distinct and very clear way, all of these adjustments and tricks and techniques that I have for these videos, so it's really easily graspable and easily visible. Of course, at the end, you can always decide to maybe just go half as much as I have done, or leave out an adjustment completely, and so on. It's all up to you. I'm just trying to give you some different techniques mainly, and what you want to do with the picture at the end, or with your pictures at the end, is completely up to you. But I think, you know, there's always some more things that you can do, especially with a picture that has so much stuff in it as this one right here. I'm just gonna say that I'm done, because otherwise the video is gonna be like 3 hours long. And this is a huge history. If I scroll down here, I think this might be the longest video I've ever done. And here's before. This doesn't even look anything close to how it is after all of the editing, and it's really so much flatter, so much more boring, dark, and afterwards, I mean, say what you want, it's a huge difference. I don't think there's much arguing in terms of that, and if you think that's overdone, if you think that looks not natural whatsoever anymore, then of course, once again, you can just go half as much as I have done, or leave out certain filters completely. And this is where I'm gonna end it. Thank you very much for watching this extremely long video. I know it must have been boring at times, but I appreciate you sticking around so long, and as weird as this might sound, I actually tried to make this as concise and as short and as interesting and as informative as possible, because at the end this is pretty much all of Lightroom, or most of Lightroom, in one single video, in-depth explained, every single adjustment, slider and so on. So I hope you've enjoyed it if you've made it through this extremely long video. And just in case you're crazy about learning Lightroom stuff, I'm gonna leave a link to a playlist with even more tutorials if that was still not enough for you. And of course you can also subscribe and do all of that other stuff that people at the end of their videos tell you to do, but a thing that I would actually really appreciate is if you could take a second to either like or dislike the video honestly. You know, if you like my other videos but you think this one was terrible, then give it a dislike, don't feel bad about it. That way I can really see which kind of videos I should make in the future. It's very, very informative and ultimately decides on the future content, so that is definitely hugely appreciated more than anything else. Take care and keep on editing great pictures.